Good afternoon. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm really excited that we have Bob Lawson and Ben Powell here today, two guys that know a lot about economic freedom. They're going to talk about what the meaning of socialism is and what the implications are, what their conclusions are, based on their experiences traveling the world and their own knowledge as economists and knowledge of economic freedom. Their conclusion is that socialism sucks, as you'll see in a little bit. I'm really excited that we have a big crowd here up in the Louise. You'll have a chance to ask your own questions at the end, so please get your questions ready to ask Bob and Ben. And so Robert Lawson is a clinical professor and holds a Jerome L. Fullenwider Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom. He is also director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at Southern Methodist University, Cox School of Business. He earned his PhD and MS in economics from Florida State University and his BS in economics from the Honors Tutorial College at Ohio University. He previously taught at Auburn University, Capital University, and Shawnee State University. Dr. Lawson is a founding co-author of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World annual report, which presents an economic freedom index of over 160 different countries. Lawson has authored or co-authored over 100 journal articles, book chapters, policy reports, and book reviews. With Benjamin Powell, he is co-author of the Amazon bestseller, Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. Benjamin Powell is the executive director of the Free Market Institute and a professor of economics in the Jerry S. Rawls College of Business Administration at Texas Tech University. He's a senior fellow with the Independent Institute, secretary-treasurer of the Southern Economic Association, secretary-treasurer of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and treasurer of the Mont Pelerin Society. He earned his BS in economics and finance from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and his MA and PhD in economics from George Mason University. So thanks to the Menard family and all our donors for making this event possible. I'm super excited about it. Bob and Ben have said that they will autograph anybody's book that wants their book autographed at the end of this session. And so without any further delay, let's welcome Bob Lawson and Ben Powell.
All right, thank you very much. It's so good to be back here. And the great thing about signing books afterwards is devaluing their resale. And that's not just because Bob signs it, it's because we write your name in it and then there's fewer people you can resell it to afterwards. So a little bit of background of how this project got started. John was nice enough to say that Bob's written more than 100 articles that many people read. And we decided we wanted to try to do something a little bit different where more people would read what we were doing. And it actually kind of started with an email from him to me. He wanted to go get drunk in Cuba, and my wife didn't really want me to just go on vacation with him. And I was like, hey, I've got this like loose idea for a book, but it's unlike anything you or I have ever written before. We want to try to write like a P.J. O'Rourke style, Anthony Bourdain style travel book about economics, and then it became socialism eventually as we refined it further. But we don't really know our ass from our elbow doing this and if we can do it or not. So why don't we use this as a test chapter? We'll write it up, see how it goes, and if our non-academic friends like it, then maybe we'll pursue this project. Plus, then it makes the Cuba trip 30% off because we're going to write it off our taxes too. So that was one part of how it got started. That's actually the honest part of how it got started, literally, was the email. But it was also what was going on in the country at the time. So at that time, it's 2016. And Bernie Sanders was just coming off a run for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, where he labels himself a democratic socialist, and young people flock to this. And I'm looking at this and saying, holy shit, what's going on? A socialist is running in the United States and getting this type of support from young people, where we're just removed from the Ron Paul campaigns of 2008 and 2012, where he was challenging in the Republican Party and attracting a wave of young people support as an anti-establishment guy. But these two people, while they're both kind of anti-Washington D politics as usual, are so diametrically opposed in their economic policies. I'm like, there's something really weird about this. So it was the right time to work on a project like this, because we were seeing, this is Michael Moore here saying that most polls now show, this is in January of 16, most young adults prefer socialism to capitalism. There's other surveys at this time that show similar things. And coming right out on the heels of this too, the New York Times runs a whole year of columns called Red Century. Every week there was one column in the New York Times dedicated to exploring the history of socialism in the 20th century based on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And in this series of columns, I think there's two that mention the economic stagnation of the former Soviet system. There's a handful that mention the atrocities that happened, and they're almost all Stalin, I think one on Mao. Nothing about Lenin and the human atrocities of him. Instead, you get taught things like Lenin's eco-warriors, how the Soviet Union was great about the environment, which is garbage, by the way. Or my personal favorite was why women have better sex under socialism, which, even if true, how you weight this against tens of millions of dead bodies, I'm not really sure. The wave of the moment of the ideology of people at this time was shifting to socialism. We thought, well, we'll do a project that's a little bit different, that reaches a different audience and communicates some of the historical functioning under socialism, the economic theory that indicates why this would be so, and tries to do it in a more fun and amusing way. So we're going to go on a little tour tonight. Here's the travel tour we're going to take. We're going to start off in Sweden, which is not socialism, despite, by the way, I love this one, whether it's Fox News or Bernie Sanders, they get it wrong. Bernie Sanders, when he says, I'm a democratic socialist, how can you be against this? It's like Sweden. And Fox News is like, oh my God, higher taxes. It's socialism, like Sweden. BS, it's not. We'll come there in one sec. Then we go to what we call starving socialism, Venezuela, subsistence socialism in Cuba, North Korea, dark socialism. What's the political party that dominates China, of course, is a communist political party, but it's fake socialism because it's actually an extraordinarily crony capitalist economic system, but it would be a mistake to think of it as socialism. Hungover socialism, which resonates with Bob and I, in the Ukraine and Russia. Then new capitalism in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And then we end the book back in the USSA, where we went to the largest socialist convention in the United States in Chicago of 2018, I think is when we wrapped up that for the book. So a little hint of this in Sweden before I turn it over to Bob to talk about Venezuela. First of all, let's just get our terms straight here at the middle. Socialism means something. It meant something to Marx. It meant something to 100 years of economists who have talked about the functioning of socialist economic systems. Let's not be confused about it. Socialism means abolishing private property in the major factors of production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. In practice, for any large society, this means state ownership of the major factors of production. So you can have smaller scale socialism, kibbutzes in Israel. You can have these various utopian societies that exist in the United States where people own things collectively. Heck, in very small islands, our families are somewhat like a socialist organization. In fact, even in its inspirational terms of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, we allocate things within a small family unit. But this is a consumption unit, not a productive unit for the most part. For the most part, our production is outside in a market economy. And then inside, I don't make my kid bid on the cereal in the closet with whether I'm going to allocate that to him or to me. Instead, we do it something like to their needs. But on large-scale societies, this means abolishing private property in the factors of production. And then, after that, and this is important, you need some way to coordinate your productive activity. This is different than a consumption activity. So I meet young socialists today, we'll talk about them at the end. Some are like, oh, it just means socialism from below. And people will just cooperate. It's like, well, no. In a market economy, we have prices and profit and loss that help us figure out how to coordinate. Like, if the tire factory is making tires of one size and the rim factory is making rims a different size, these two things get reconciled when you can't sell them against each other. If we're just doing socialism from below and we're not using private property or market prices, someone's got to have a plan and tell everybody else how to organize. This from below doesn't have a natural reconciliation process the way a market economy does. So with that in mind, of the definition being abolishing of private property and government being the major owner of your factors of production, Sweden is not socialist. Volvo is a private company. Go to Sweden. The hotels are privately owned. In fact, Bob, one of the thing he's most known for in his career is not this fun, playful drinking book with me, but is measuring economic freedom, basically, how close to capitalism versus how close to socialism you are, across countries around the world. And he's been doing this since 1995. Sweden, at the time that we wrote the book, was the 27th freest economy in the world. It has strong private property rights, freedom to trade internationally, sound money, low levels of regulation of credit and business. It's got some labor market regs, and it's got a big welfare state, and a big welfare state with high taxes. So Bob and I think that there's problems with a big welfare state and high taxes, but we shouldn't confuse this with socialism. Sweden is mostly prosperous because it's mostly capitalist. It had basically a laissez-faire century from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, where it became eventually the fourth wealthiest country in the world. Then it put in a big welfare state and high taxes. After that, it grew more slowly. Now it's in the bottom half of OECD countries in terms of per capita income. And I think legitimate people can have differences of opinion of, would you like a bigger welfare state and slow growth that makes you less prosperous versus lower taxes, less welfare state, and more prosperous? But that shouldn't be confused with the debate about socialism, because Sweden's not that, and that's why it's mostly good. And by the way, the sub-theme of this book, the two economists drink their way around the unfree world, this was, one, it's how Bob and I live our lives, and as an honest account of our traveling, that's what made it in there. But it also works as a metaphor for how all these economies function. In Sweden, there's delicious beer. Not so much Swedish beer, but stuff from other places in Europe that are available locally. Belgian beer, that's us sitting outside Café Duval right there. And it was delicious, except they taxed the hell out of everything, so it's really expensive. We literally drank Belgian beer on the other side of the world in South Korea for lower prices than what you could get it in Sweden because of the taxes. Bob, why don't you tell us about the next part of the journey?
All right, so Sweden is not socialism, so let's go to actual socialism. Venezuela, we call this chapter Starving Socialism. That's not entirely an exaggeration, because the people of Venezuela are actually losing weight en masse. Even the government statistics will say that the average Venezuelan has lost between 20 and 30 pounds. And they're not on Jenny Craig. I could stand to lose 20 pounds myself, but these people the country of Venezuela is quite literally struggling to provide enough calories for the people to sustain their body weights. And so we wanted to see what's going on in Venezuela. We were a little too lazy to get visas for Venezuela, so we went to Colombia and flew to a town called Cucuta, which is right on the Venezuelan-Colombian border. And on the Colombian border, there are bridges that cross across the little river between the two countries. And every day, today, yesterday, the last several years, thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans every day cross from Venezuela into Colombia, and they're going shopping. And they're shopping for things like you see in the bottom right: rice, beans, sugar, deodorant, shampoo, aspirin. They're going grocery shopping. And why are hundreds, literally over time, thousands and thousands and thousands of people every day crossing into Venezuela? Well, there's nothing to buy in Venezuela. Right? The food is completely scarce. And the reason is Venezuela has gone socialist. One of the really interesting things about Venezuelan socialism is it's the only example I think either one of us can think of socialism that was elected democratically. Hugo Chavez was elected in a more or less free and fair election. His second election was a little less free and fair, but still mostly. But today, Venezuela is it's not democratic, it's just socialism. All right, they've shut down newspapers, shut down radio stations, shutting down the press. They're arresting dissidents and political opponents. It is just a good old-fashioned totalitarian or authoritarian socialist state. And that's one of the points we wanted to make. Again, mentioned Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders likes to call himself a democratic socialist. As economists, we actually think democratic socialism is a bit of an oxymoron. It's very hard for a government to control the economic means of production, the factories, the farms, but also then say, well, you can freely discuss matters on the streets, and you can have open and free elections and free newspapers. If the governments are going to control the economic means of production, they inevitably, we think, will end up controlling the civil liberties and freedoms of people in terms of freedom of speech and voting and things of that sort. So let's tell a fun story. Let's talk about alcohol. Again, alcohol isn't the theme of the book. It's a sub-theme. The poor Venezuelans. The government of Venezuela controls the economy now. One of the key things they control is the money supply. That's Ben holding. He's got a stack of currency he's holding in his hand, about yay high, about a foot and a half tall if you stacked it up. That's about $20.
It was.
Well, now $20 would
It's
be
about 20 cents.
would fill up this room. But that's about $20 at the time. I took a $20 bill and I handed it to somebody on the street, and he handed us just stacks of currency. So Venezuela's having a serious monetary problem, massive hyperinflation. And one of the things they do is, because if they had a free and open currency exchange situation, what would all Venezuelans do? They'd change their money into dollars. So Venezuela's government controls the foreign exchange. They control the access to dollars. Well, if you're a beer company in Venezuela, a company's called Polar. It's their Budweiser. It's their national beer company. Polar needs to get dollars from the government in order to buy, is it barley? What do they have to buy? Barley. They don't make barley in Guatemala or in Venezuela apparently, so they have to buy the barley. But they don't have dollars to buy the barley, so guess what? God forbid, they actually have had times where they've had to shut down the beer production for the whole country because they don't have the dollars to buy the barley, and no barley, no beer. And our joke in the book is that if we were running a socialist economy ourselves, it would go to crap because socialism sucks, but we would not run out of beer. We'd run out of everything else first. We would at least make sure, even the Soviets made sure they always had alcohol, right? They would run out of toilet paper, they'd run out of chicken, they'd run out of butter, but they would always have alcohol. So the Venezuelans are in such a situation that they don't even have that. Ben, how about you talk about Cuba?
Sure. All right, so Cuba is, we call it subsistence socialism in that it's chugging along. It's not, Venezuela is a crisis. It was a relatively newer socialist country. It looked like it was doing okay for a while the oil boom was happening in the early 2000s, but basically it was, hollowing out inside. And once oil prices and production came down in 2013, it was revealed that it couldn't feed itself anymore, and what Bob described. Cuba's been chugging along, obviously, for a lot longer. And as academics, we're free in the United States. Actually, we went during the period when the Obama administration had liberalized travel to Cuba. It's not, the Cubans don't care, the Cuban government doesn't care that you come there. It's the US government that puts the restrictions on you going there. And during the late years of the Obama administration, he qualified people-to-people aid, which meant basically bring an extra roll of toilet paper and say, hey, I'm going to give this away while I'm in Cuba, and then it was okay for you to go there. As academics, we could always go for research. And this is, of all the countries, I mean, there's really only 3 truly functioning, so there's a lot of economies in the world that don't have strong private property rights or lots of economic freedoms, but there's only 3 that are really centrally planned socialist economies anymore, maybe 4. But Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea. Cuba's the one that you're the most free to just go around and engage in the most mundane day-to-day economic activities and kind of see how something functions. So let's do more pictures in this one, and we're gonna think a little bit about a lot when you're in Cuba, it's like, it feels a little bit off, and you're not quite sure why for a little while, even as an economist, and as you interact more and more, you start to see it. So here is, now remember, definition, government ownership of the major factors of production. Hotels, that's a major factor of production. Government owns all of the hotels in Cuba. So we're gonna be able to do a little contrast here in a second. So we went to Hotel Trinton. This is in the suburbs of Havana, right on the coast. And we weren't sandbagging this. In fact, it was somebody who worked for Bob who was it who recommended? We had a friend. It was someone else who recommended to us this hotel as an okay place. No. So you can see the gleaming picture in the top left. That's the picture in the lobby from when it opened. It has that Soviet-style architecture, a little bit more vertical than most of what you see in Eastern Europe, but same style. On the bottom right, you can see the state of it by the time we stayed there in 2016, where it's got all of the exhaust fumes and everything else, which you can't see from that picture very easily. You can see a little bit, if your eyes are good, of broken windows and broken balcony glass on all of these things. The bottom left, now look at the height of those buildings. There's 4 elevators for the entire thing. 3 of them were out of service. You can see the SER going across telling you on one of them. So one elevator, so Bob and I had to heft our stuff up to the room. And what we were greeted with was a beautiful room. Ceiling tiles missing in the bathroom, mold all over the place. The air conditioner did work, thankfully. Now, this wasn't the only one of these we stayed in. So later, I guess on the, I don't know, towards the end of our stay in Cuba, we stayed another night in a different government hotel downtown in the central part of Havana, right near the seat of government. And in fact, we had come back from like a 5-hour car ride from Trinidad, hot, sweaty, miserable. And I'm like, let's just go in this place, get a beer. We go in to get a beer, and Bob's like, we didn't have reservations anywhere. He's like, there's a hotel right next door. I'm like, I don't want to stay there if it's as shitty as the other one. He's like, I'll go check it out. I'm like, so I sat there and had a beer. I'm pretty sure the air conditioning that worked in that tricked him again, because these other pictures are from that place, where you can see the glass that came out of the sanitized bag that has the stains on it, the hole in the towel. If you look at that toilet, notice the missing bolt. So like you sit down on the toilet seat and like you slide a little bit, which if you make a real mess, it's nice because they left you the previous guest's soap that's sitting there. Let's play a little game. We're going to play a game. It's going to be called The Price is Wrong. We'll play this for the rest of Cuba. Want to guess what these hotel cost? Both of them are about the same. What? 59. He's pretty spot on. I think it was like 62 or 3 at one of them and about 65 at the other. So by the way, when we play Price is Wrong, guess high or low. It's going to be one of those two things. And this is partly right because private property rights allow for exchange. Market exchange generates market prices that reflect real relative scarcities. In a socialist country, you don't have that. You have a state-managed system where the prices are not generated by real relative scarcities that match the globe. So everything's price seems a little bit wrong. Now, Cuba also has, so these things, socialist capitalism, it's not zeros and ones. Everything's a spectrum. And even in Cuba, in fact, they've changed their laws since we've been there. At this point, they were allowing, and they had been since the late 2000s, middle 2000s, what they called casa particular. So you had a right to live in your apartment. You couldn't sell it like the way you can your condo or something here, but you got the right to rent it out for a profit. So you can Airbnb places in Cuba, which is impressive because the internet basically doesn't work in Cuba. What does work is their relatives in Miami. So if you and your credit cards don't work. So you can Airbnb a place via their relatives in Miami who then call their friends in Cuba and tell them when you're showing up. And they're actually there to let you in, unlike Hotel Trinton when we got to the lobby, which you had to book through a British firm, and then they didn't have any record of our reservation. Bob starts talking to him. I went and drank a couple beers, and he solved this eventually by handing him, I think, $50 or something like that. And then all of a sudden, oh, reservation, they found it. This Casa Particular was a 2-bedroom. You can see kind of through those doors. 2-bedroom place, a little kitchen, a little living room, balcony, central Havana, right off the Malecon, which we think means bad economics, but it's actually the road that's on the coast outside Havana. The other picture, I think, is a different Casa Particular that we had in Trinidad. When we had got down there, again, hot, sweaty, we went to a bar, we're sitting there, and this girl sees our bags, and she's like, oh, you want a hotel room? And I'm like, yeah, I'll check it out. And go upstairs, and I was like, yeah, there's 2 beds, air conditioning, and there's a big balcony, and there's a full bar right below us. So when Bob can't hang with me at the end of the night, I can go up there and chain smoke cigars and get rums from the bar downstairs and keep going. Want to guess the prices on these? Nobody wants to play The Price is Wrong? All right, the first one, the 2-bedroom one in Havana, was about the same as the shitty hotel room, about $60. The other one was $25 a night. But look at the difference. So this is same service accommodations. One, a version of private property rights. The other, state ownership. The hotels suck, not because people don't know how to do accommodations, but because no one cares. The Casa Particulares, you have private owners who get a little bit of income from it. They reinvest their income in making capital improvements so that they can make more income from it. Private property rights provide incentives, doing the exact same industry in the same country. Also, you've all probably been in a hotel before where you don't have hot water. I bet you most of you haven't been at a hotel where you just wake up and don't have water. That happened at the government hotel in Cuba. Turns out, when you do equality of wages across professions, you get lots of musicians, not too many freaking plumbers. Meanwhile, Casa Particular had not just water, but hot water. Couple things wrong in these pictures. So we'll do this and then I'll turn it over to Bob to tell you more about Cuba. So top left, that's a commercial street in downtown central Havana. What's wrong with this picture? No car, okay, no cars. Bob will talk about cars in a second. That's true, but that actually is a pedestrian street. So that's not the one in that one. What else is wrong with it? No signs. Ever traveled to poor countries in the world? Bob and I have been into plenty of really poor countries. There's always signs. Like, so the way we'd like do our research is like we'd walk around and find a bar, have a beer, get out, walk again, stop, and just keep. But when you get to a street corner and you look, there's nothing to tell you if there's a commercial establishment on the street or not. In the poorest countries, whoever the local beer producer is makes signs for everybody else as long as you sell their beer on property. Everybody has signs. Why don't they have signs in Cuba? No one gives a shit if you come to their store or not. They don't make extra profits by it. Why advertise it? The customers, much like in the Soviet Union, are a mild inconvenience. Actually, Bob, I'll talk about the top right, and I'll turn it to you for restaurants before you get to cars. Top right, that's a well-stocked convenience store. What's wrong with that picture? We could show you pictures of poorly stocked convenience stores. That's a well-stocked one. What's wrong with it? Complete lack of variety. It's well stocked, but there's like one of every distinct item. You can see the water, their version of cola. I called it Commie Cola. I don't think that was its real name. There's actually one place that had Coca-Cola. Bob and I found it in a private restaurant. And then like 3 days later, we were taking a different car and asked where I could go to get Coca-Cola. And they like drive 20 minutes out of their way to that same restaurant. I'm like, oh, everyone knows this is the place where smuggled Coca-Cola is. Versus the Commie Cola. But there's no variety. So when Bernie Sanders says things like, oh, why do we need 17 types of deodorant? People in the United States are like, yeah, why do we need 17 types of deodorant? Well, first of all, I bet you there's more than 17 types of deodorant in use in this room. Each have different preferences. But for lots of things, we value options in and of themselves. Cuba doesn't have those. In Cuba, they have two types of beer, Cristal and Bucanero. Cristal and Bucanero are both about 4.5% alcohol, and they both taste like a Budweiser that someone left out in the sun a little bit too long. Versus capitalism is very different. Here, this is Fargo Brewing Company, Stone's Throw Scottish Ale. Wait a second, Scottish Ale in Fargo, North Dakota, locally produced? I've never tried this before. That's gonna change in just a moment. It says, drink Fargo, the beer for any occasion. I don't think they anticipated talks at NDSU when they put that on their label, but it's going to be true now. And it's delicious. And meanwhile, I have for Bob here.
Oh, thank you.
This is Techno Viking. Well, you can tell him what it is. In fact, you can tell him what it is, and then you can tell him about the restaurants, because I'm going to enjoy my
You all
beer
know
for
what
any
this
occasion.
is. This is Techno Viking Berliner Weiss Sour. So anyway, yeah, so let's talk about the food and drink in Cuba. When you first get there, it's like, oh, it looks nice. It's kind of like any Caribbean country. There are some bars and restaurants. But then you go into some of the bars and restaurants and you realize, this is a government bar, because like no one's coming over to take our order. Like you have to, almost tackle someone to find some customer service. But they do have, like the Casas Particulares, like the privately owned hotels, they have private restaurants now. And they started out as just a few chairs and a table in someone's home. They would literally just invite people into their home and they could charge, and somebody would make a meal for people. But now there's some pretty good commercial establishments. I think the limit at that time was 50 people, but we saw some private restaurants that had like 200 seats. So I think what they were doing is they were getting 4 licenses and kind of combining them into one facility. So the restaurants at first, like, oh, this is the private restaurant. It's nice. It's nice. The waitresses came over right away, took our order, and then you got the food and you realized it's the same food as the other restaurants, the government restaurants. One of the problems for the private restaurants in Cuba is that the government still controls all of the wholesale food production. And one of the most disturbing things about Cuban food is the lack of salt. Apparently, Fidel Castro thinks salt is bourgeois, and the government doesn't produce salt, they don't import salt, and they don't pay money to import it. So the food, if you don't know how bad most of the food we eat tastes until you've eaten it without any salt. So my advice to go to Cuba, and I don't actually advise you to go to Cuba because it's mostly terrible, but if you do go, bring some salt, or what I found is there was smuggled Tabasco everywhere. American Tabasco was smuggled in, and that's mostly salt, so I just kept asking for Tabasco and would sprinkle it liberally over everything. But we had the same contrast in the restaurants, though. We had the two versions of the restaurants. We had government state-controlled restaurants and privately owned restaurants side by side, and the contrast was really spectacular for two economists. I've lost my, where's the thing go? Ben?
That's what happens when you put beer in the podium. You forget about the other things that are part of the talk.
So when talking about Cuba, you got to talk about the cars a little bit. So I'm a car guy. I've got a few old cars. Ben's the car guy. I don't know how many old cars you have now. I've got a few. When you first get to Cuba, you're like, oh, you've heard about the cars in Cuba, right? The old 1950s American cars. We were in a 57 Plymouth once. I forget the other car. The car in the background here, this is in Havana. The red one, I think it's a Chevy. 50s era Chevy, and then the guy in front of him with a 1991 Renault. There was a brief period in the 90s when the Cuban government imported some French cars. I think initially they were taxis, but then after they got through with their usefulness as taxis, they just sort of ended up on a sort of secondary car market. The price is wrong. Let's talk about the prices. Now, that red, the cars are terrible. When you first get there, you're excited. Oh, I'm going to be in a 56 Plymouth. How cool is this? And then you realize, well, it's a John Deere tractor engine now because the Detroit motor blew up 30 years ago. The suspension is held together with bubble gum and tape. The air conditioner, if it ever had it, is long since busted. It's terrible. It's absolutely horrible. Like 20 minutes into a taxi drive, you're like, get me the heck out of this car. This is miserable. I want to walk, right? That car in the background would be, in the American classic car market, would be a barn find. It's a car you would pay a couple $1,000s for, maybe to fix it up, or maybe it's a parts car for your real project. That car in the back, that Chevy, as old as it is not very valuable in the United States classic car market. A couple $1,000s maybe in the US market. What do you think that red Chevy in the background is worth in Cuba? Now bear in mind, Cubans are really poor. Income statistics in Cuba are crap. But the average Cuban probably makes somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000. I'm being generous. That's not a lot of money. So how much money do you think these poor Cubans will pay for a red car like that Chevy in the background? That's adorable. That's actually not too far off. It's about $15,000 to $20,000 for a sort of 50s era American car. It's absolutely absurd. For $15,000, go on a classic car American, go on Facebook Marketplace or something today and see what you can get for $15,000. You can get a very nice 1956 Chevy, not a show car, not a museum caliber car, but you can get yourself a very nice classic American vehicle for $15,000. Now, it's going to get much worse or better, depending on your point of view. The guy in the foreground there in that white Renault, or Peugeot, I don't know what it is. Now, let's face it, it's a 1991 Renault. It was a piece of crap the day it was built. It's 30-something years old now. It's a horrible car. How much is that car worth in America? That's almost impossible to answer because there are no 1991 Renaults available for sale in the United States of America. Like, no one is that poor to need to buy that car. That's how bad that car is. But look at the guy. He is like, look at me, it's my car. He's proud of that car. How much is that car in Cuba? It's $35,000, US dollars. That car's a $100 car in America. It's $35,000. Poor, no, why is, because he's the richest guy in Cuba. He's one of the richest people, because he has, in Cuban terms, that's $250,000, like compared to our car. That's like a Maserati, it's not even a Maserati, that's an Aston Martin in Cuban terms. That car is 1,000 times more than average income, right? So the Cuban government won't let cars come into the country. And what has happened, because you don't let cars come into the country, and that's not the US embargo. We're kind of against the US embargo. We take a stand in the book against the US embargo. We think that policy's failed. But the US embargo has not stopped the cars from coming into Cuba. What stops the cars from coming into Cuba is the Cuban government won't allow them to come in. And supply and demand, Econ 101, like day one of Econ 101, supply and demand does its magic. If you reduce the number of cars available, even in a very, very, very poor country, the price skyrockets. And you get people driving around 30-year-old Renaults who are, in their context, actually quite rich. Don't go to Cuba, it's really terrible. I'm going to continue talking about Korea for just a minute. This is this chapter. We went to South Korea and we went to the border of North Korea. We don't have a death wish. So seriously, within 6 months of us being there, a young kid, some college kid, went to North Korea stupidly and was murdered by the government. And so we were not, and I'd already said things in like some of my books and articles about how the North Koreans were terrible people. So I'm like, I'm not going to go to North Korea. So we went to South Korea, talked about that a little bit in the chapter, but then we went to Dandong, China, which is on the North Korean border, right on the Yalu River, if you remember your North Korea history, the Korean War history. And there's a river between the two countries. It's not mined. You could actually fairly easily, if you're fit enough, swim across the river. There are guard towers painted in sort of Smurf blue. The North Koreans paint their guard towers like this kind of baby blue, which is adorable. But they will shoot you if you try to swim across. But most importantly, if you're a North Korean, if you want to escape North Korea, and you swim across the river, if you manage to make it, you end up in China, and the North Koreans have rewards that they offer for people who get turned in. So many, frankly, unscrupulous Chinese will befriend North Koreans and then turn them into the North Koreans. So anyway, in this chapter, we talk about the history of socialism. And we have natural experiments like the casas in Cuba, the government hotels versus the private casas. We also have a natural experiment, of course, in Korea, the Korean Peninsula. Before the Korean War, South Korea was the poor part of Korea, and North Korea was the industrial rich part. Obviously, that has changed, right? South Korea today is one of the richest market-oriented economies in the world. North Korea has gone to essentially the hardest version of state control of the economy and really all aspects of life of any country on earth. And so the contrast was great. We didn't get into it again, but you can see the photos. Let me tell one story. The anecdotes are fun. So we were looking across the river at some farmlands, and you can see the land undulates a little bit. There was a poor farmer on the North Korean side. He was driving an old diesel tractor. You could tell it was a diesel. It had that, that thump, thump, thump diesel sound. And you could hear the sound coming across the valley towards us. And it was trying to go up this little slope. I mean, it couldn't have been more than like just the tiniest little grade. And it's trying to get up. You can tell it's puffing. It's doing the diesel, puff, 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 and he finally just gives up, the poor guy, and he just lets the thing roll back down. This poor tractor was not capable of literally taking the tiniest hills that he was, and so we saw lots of people over there using animals to farm their lands, just like the 19th century. You've all seen this photograph. It's a little tiresome to see it, but that's not a Photoshop. In fact, from space, the North Korean side of the Korean Peninsula is almost, except for the capital, is almost entirely dark. The Chinese city of Dandong is that very sort of the upper left part of North Korea. That big bright spot there, that's Dandong. That's the Chinese border, and that's where we were. And when we landed, we landed from Beijing. I think we came directly from Beijing. We landed at night, and when we landed, we were like, oh, we're in Dandong, and North Korea is right across the river. So we rushed down to look across the river, and it's literally darkness. There was no. Now, when you wake up in the morning, if you look on the right-hand side picture, those two pictures, the top left and the right, those are the same photograph. Those are the same perspectives. When you wake up in the morning and you look across the river, all that stuff in the foreground is China. All the high rises, that's China. Everything in the background, though, that's a city over there. There are hundreds of thousands of North Koreans living over there. But at night, it was utterly black. And it was really kind of unnerving to see, to realize that there's hundreds of thousands of people living in essentially medieval conditions. So anyway, that Photoshop, that's not a Photoshop. That's not something, if you've ever seen this photograph before, it's not something that someone just made up. Talk about fake socialism, Ben.
All right, so China under Mao was real socialism. In fact, as we think of these things across a spectrum, probably the two closest, so if you think of complete abolition of private property and replacing with state or collective ownership and central planning, the two most complete moves in that direction were the Soviet Union during the period of war communism, during the revolution and right afterwards under Lenin before he started reforming the new economic policy, and Mao from 1957 to about 61 or 2 during the Great Leap Forward. So during China's period of real socialism, of complete collectivization, there was massive, actually in all of human history, the greatest loss of life in any country ever from government policy. Absolute stagnation economically. Then afterwards you get the Cultural Revolution, and Mao's dead by the mid-1970s. 1978, Deng Xiaoping, who used to work under Mao in the administration but had got purged for his lack of loyalty or more non-traditional views, becomes in charge of China, and China starts its period of reform. From then till about 2010, 2012, China was on a march towards the market. And it went from being one of the most socialist economic systems ever to something that's much, much, much more of a market economy. It starts with town and village enterprises. It starts with allowing individual entrepreneurs in urban areas, to employ people who are returning from the Cultural Revolution re-education rural areas back to the cities because the state didn't have anything for them to do. And over time, more and more, what was happening in China is de facto reforms were occurring that later the central party would sanction and say, oh yeah, that's part of our economic system. So Deng Xiaoping would say, he had a phrase of, it doesn't matter what color the cat is as long as it catches the mice. And he'd say, we're doing socialism with Chinese characteristics. And what I'd say, all these things that were market reforms moving you towards becoming more economically free, less centrally planned. By the time you get into the 2000s, China, the vast bulk of economic activity is responding to prices, property rights, profit and loss, international market signals. The state still messes with things in this crony capitalism. It rigs industries, particularly finance in China is dominated by the state, and that impacts other businesses. But you have these big disparities within China of how market-orientated you are. Places in like Shanghai and others that are located along the coast of these special economic zones have economic freedoms that are almost as good as Hong Kong's. And meanwhile, what's happening internally in China, hundreds of millions of people are moving from unfree rural areas to more free economic area, more economically free areas where their productivity is higher. The productivity differences between the more free cities and the less ones are not unlike the differences between Latin America and the United States. Except here, so part of, by the way, Chinese growth, when people are like, oh, I'm not sure if these numbers are true, some of it's not true, but some of it is, you're just moving people from places where they can't be very productive to places where they are very productive, except unlike migration from, say, Venezuela to the United States, everybody was in the denominator before. So when they become more productive by moving, that registers as economic growth the year that they move. That's starting to peter out over the next few years, according to demographers in China, of what's happening there. But China then, we call it fake socialism because it's a communist political party that has a monopoly on the politics of the country. But it would be a mistake to say government ownership of the means of production or the majority of their economic activity now. Private markets with distorted prices and interference are, but again, this is on the spectrum. And now I'd say they're on the kind of crony capitalist spectrum. That doesn't mean that they're not an authoritarian regime that doesn't tolerate other types of freedoms. And this has become increasingly so. In fact, the economic reforms that I started to describe basically stall once Xi Jinping becomes president. They really haven't made any more further on-net economic reforms becoming more economically free over the last 10 years. And politically and civilly, they've become less economically free, which was already low to start with. Bob and I experienced a little of this. We had talked to a guy actually in South Korea, and when he heard that we were going to be in Beijing, he said, "Oh, we're running this conference at the Unirural Institute. It's on Ayn Rand and Austrian economics," which seems like a weird thing to be doing in Beijing. And they're like, "Well, if the two of you guys would talk there, that'd be great." And we're like, "Hell yeah, we're into that." And it was like, I don't know, audience probably about this size, but it was all Chinese professors and PhD students. And we made our comments and had our thing, didn't think that much of it. Went to dinner that night, and the next morning we got a message from a friend who had introduced us. They said, "I hope you didn't go to the second day of the Unirural conference. Government thugs chained the door closed, were beating up people trying to enter the conference." And that was the beginning of the demise of Unirural, which had been founded in the early 1990s, and it helped with many of the reforms in China over the years. They now no longer exist as a business. And of course, what we've been seeing over the last few years in Hong Kong is the oppression of the civil and freedom of the presses and other things in Hong Kong of people who have opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. Interest of time, I'll be really brief on Russia, Ukraine, and then turn it over to you to talk to a more happy case about the Republic of Georgia. In the book, if you get just dropped in Moscow, other than some of the architecture, you could be anywhere in Western Europe. And really Kiev also feels like a modern, reformed economy. The economies of these countries aren't. They are parasitic economies where the elites in the capital extract wealth from everybody else, and it makes the capital feel a lot richer than what the reality is for most of the country. Bob and I took a little flack recently. By the way, this book was published in 2019, before the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And somebody was accusing us of being pro-Putin sympathizers for what we wrote in this book, which is kind of an odd thing to accuse Bob and I of. But what I guess they had their beef with was we pointed out that neither one of these places are economically free or liberal democratic. If you look at their economic freedom, actually Ukraine was a little bit worse than Russia prior to the start of this recent war. And in terms of political freedoms, while Putin's an authoritarian, in Ukraine, while we were there, Mikhail Saakashvili, who he could tell you more about in the context of Georgia, who had a Ukrainian passport that was revoked, had come back into the country to oppose the current president in 2017 in order to run against him on an anti-corruption campaign. And they tried to arrest him, and his supporters had to protect him. We ended up having dinner with him, and then a few weeks later, he ultimately ended up getting arrested and deported for someone who was or had Ukrainian citizenship and was running for president. That's how they did liberal democracy in Ukraine circa 2017. So the idea of this, like what the media wants to give you on this, I'm like, don't get me wrong, I would prefer Russia to lose this war and Ukraine to remain independent. And hopefully, maybe that turns them to a more westward embrace where they become more liberal democratic in the broad sense as a result. But the idea that before this started, that's where it was, I was like, not really so. And we were right in that before it got all politicized. Interestingly, these pictures, I'll just tell you the bottom right, that's in Moscow. That's the line to get into Lenin's tomb. And it's kind of funny because the history of the Soviet Union, right, was everybody waited in lines for everything because the market prices was wrong. Well, the price to visit Lenin's tomb is zero. So as a result, there's a long line to get in there, and that's what we saw in Red Square. Tell them about Georgia. That's a more fun one.
Yeah, Georgia's a bit more fun. So Georgia was a Soviet republic. After a brief period of independence, Lenin's Bolsheviks reinvaded Georgia in 1921. So Georgia was a part of the Soviet Union for basically all of the Soviet existence. And I want to talk a little bit about the central planning aspect. So, the Soviet economy was a centrally planned economy. There were bureaucrats in Moscow whose job it was to decide how many tractors got made, how many cars got made, how many 2x4s got made, how many nails got made. Everything had to be done by a centrally planned bureaucracy in Moscow, and that included wine production. Well, the Soviet central planners in Moscow aren't morons. They knew the Georgians were good at making wine. In fact, Georgians claim, and I think they're correct here, archaeologically speaking, the earliest known evidence of wine cultivation on Earth is Georgia. It's like 8,000 years ago. It's 6,000 BC. So So the Georgians are, as far as we know, the first people on planet Earth to make wine. That's like what the archaeologists have found anyway. And the Georgians are very proud of their wine culture. So the Soviet central planners said, oh, we're going to have to make some wine for our people to drink. And let's have the Georgians make the wine because they're good at it historically. So what did they do? Well, they imported French grapes, Chardonnays and Merlots and other things. And they planted massive hundreds and thousands of acres of bad French grapes. The Georgians made massive quantities of Merlot and Chardonnay and sent this. So if you were a Moldovan or a Pole or somewhere in Siberia, Estonia, if you were a part of the old Soviet Union, you probably drank Georgian wine because that was the stuff that the Soviet central planner. Now, of course, it was pure crap. Now, what happens in 1991? Well, 1991, the Soviet Union begins to fall apart. Georgia becomes independent, and the Georgians have all this wine production, and who wants to buy Georgian Merlot? Well, no one really wants to buy Merlot at all, but who wants to buy Georgian Chardonnay? Like, it's not good. So all of these Georgian wine enterprises, all the former government-owned wineries and vineyards, they all failed. They all went bankrupt because no one wants to buy Georgian wine on the global wine market when you can buy French wine. So what has happened, though, since then is the Georgians have embraced capitalism. In 2004, 2005, a new government came in. Mikhail Saakashvili was another guy named Kaha Bendukidze. There's no quiz on the names later. But Kaha was a fanatic kind of free market guy like Ben and me, and he became in charge of the government reforms in Georgia, and he ushered in a series of liberalizations. The index that I do, the Economic Freedom Index, Georgia at one point reached the top 10. I think right now they're in the teens. But Georgia went from being a Soviet republic to being in the top 20 of the Economic Freedom Index that I do. This is probably the biggest transformation of any economy that's ever happened in the history of the planet in a short period of time like this, inside of a decade. But what's great, to continue with the alcohol metaphor, what's great is if you go to Georgia today, the Georgians have themselves re-embraced and created large numbers of wine businesses based on not French wines, but on Georgian grapes. Georgia has hundreds of varieties that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Each village has its own special grapes that only exist in that village. And they've been cultivating these things for hundreds of years. And so if you go to Georgia today, you'll see a variety of wine that is just far greater than you're going to see almost anywhere else in the world. One of the cool things, if you ever go to Georgia, and if you're lucky enough, I do some do sell in Fargo. Where at Drecker? What the Harry? Drecker? Somewhere sells it. They're white wines. The Georgian style of white wine making is a bit more primitive than the French style, and the white wines come out a very kind of amber color, almost the color of a beer. So it's an orange wine or an amber wine. And I don't know that I like it a lot because I kind of prefer reds, but it's different. And so the metaphor in the chapter on Georgia of the transformation of Georgia being a Soviet economy to now being essentially a capitalist economy. And wine became the very nice way to tell that story. And also we drank a lot of really great Georgian wine and also had a lot of really good Georgian food. Stalin, of course, was Georgian. He was born in the city of Gori in Georgia, and we visited his birthplace, and I had some words with him. That was me being juvenile with respect to Stalin's statue there. I'm going to set at the beginning of this, and I'll let you finish, Ben. So we didn't know how to end this book, but if you go back to the beginning of this talk and our introduction, we were concerned about the kids these days, right? You know, these 40% or something of young people who fill out surveys saying that they have a favorable view of socialism. And we think socialism sucks. So why are large numbers of young people embracing socialism? This confused us. Part of it, and the reason we wrote the book, was to try to describe to people what socialism is and how it's performed. It's not done well. But we didn't know how to kind of end the book, and a friend of ours suggested we go to the Chicago Socialism Conference. Every year they have a conference. The title of the conference is Socialism. Young people, hundreds, thousands of young people. You see the room there. It's large numbers of people. And they call each other comrade. It's really weird to be called comrade. But we went to this conference, and we weren't being, we were being genuine. We signed up using our own names. We weren't playing gotcha journalism. We weren't trying to catch any of these. We just wanted to understand a little bit about what these young people thought and why they thought socialism was a good idea. The good news is there's really about three types of people there. About 1/3 of the people there were they were single-issue leftists. In other words, they cared about, say, abortion rights, or they cared about racism in police or something. Okay, there were individual issues of concern to them, and Ben and I are kind of libertarians. We actually shared a lot of the same concerns with the students, but they had somehow or another deduced or come to the opinion that turning the economy over to the government, which is socialism, that somehow socialism was going to solve the problem of racist cops. And I'm like, socialist cops were pretty awful too, so I don't know how that's going to fix the problem. So some of the people were just, they had a cause that they cared about, and for whatever reason that I really don't understand, they've come to the belief that socialism was a solution for that cause. I think they're mistaken on that. But it wasn't like these kids weren't evil. They weren't wearing pictures of Stalin or Mao. It wasn't like they were favorable towards that. There was another group of people that had a little bit more sophisticated group who liked socialism because it was the socialism from below that Ben mentioned. It was a kinder, gentler socialism. Oh, not the Maoist kind, not the one that killed 10 or 20 million people, not the Stalin kind that killed 5 to 15 million or whatever, not the kind that murders and pillages, the nice kind. We're going to have like worker-run cooperatives. But then, Ben and I have economic problems with that because worker-run cooperatives can run a brewery, but you're not going to get an iPhone from a worker-run cooperative. It's just not going to happen. That level of industrial complexity and engineering skill and technology, the kind of stuff our standard of living is based on, is not going to come from little co-ops. And I love co-ops. And the beautiful thing about capitalism is it allows for people to make co-ops and have that kind of ownership structure for their businesses if they so choose. But then there was a small group of people who probably were, as we would like to call them, tankies. They actually liked Mao and Stalin. They were smart enough not to advertise that fact, but they probably were hard kind of socialists. But that was really the smallest group. Most of the people were there were, I think, good people, well-intentioned people. I think they were mistaken about the economics of what socialism is and how it works, but at least they weren't evil. All right, Ben, you finish it off. Talk about the beer, and we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll say one more within this groups, and I think you described well. There was a lot, so they were attracted to socialism because of its aspirational ends. That it's going to end alienation, that it's going to promote equality, end oppression. Things that all sound good and that I agree with. It's just they don't think about the mechanism then of if we abolish private property, does that actually get us there? And if the answer is no, and how these systems function as Bob and I have seen them, that's a bad solution for the things that you legitimately see as problems. The other is a lack of appreciation for the relationship between economic and political freedoms. Once you give up your economic freedoms and the state has control over your livelihood, it's very hard to exercise political freedoms. But if you give up your economic freedoms, you're going to get, because of the economic processes under capitalism versus socialism, you're going to get stagnation and retrogression. Usually voters throw the bums out of office when you get that. It's not an impossibility, but it's a real oddity to think we're going to have a government that centralizes power over everyone's economic lives, that necessarily will stagnate the system, and then we'll just be like, okay, throw us out. It's not an accident that they've all been authoritarian regimes. That's the outcome of what you set up when you create that economic system. And so the democratic socialism is an empty set. It's not stable. You get Venezuela, that was democratic socialism very briefly. When economic stagnation hits in, it becomes authoritarian socialism. That was the more intellectual point, because otherwise you were just going to leave me.
I went to sleep there. So
yeah. Otherwise you're going to leave me with just beer. So the fun thing here, I don't know if you can see the green tap handle there. It's Revolution Brewing Company in Illinois, and all of their stuff has commie propaganda on all of its logos. So that's a green tap handle with a fist and a red star on it. And the capitalist Hilton Hotel understood its audience that day, and that's what they put on tap for the kids. But the irony is, actually, if you look at Revolution Brewing Company's selection of beers, its quality and variety exceeds the variety of beer produced in all of the socialist countries in the world remaining in the small capitalist worker-owned, or not worker, it was a small capitalist brewery in Illinois. So that's the end of the book. We did really well. As John mentioned, we made it to number 5 on Amazon overall as a bestseller, like we were right behind Where the Crawdads Sing. But what Bob and I are actually most proud of is that we were simultaneously the number 1 bestseller in the category of beer and the number 1 bestseller in communism and socialism on Amazon. That wasn't what we set out to do, but that was kind of fun. So with that, we'll wrap up and take any questions that you have.
We have a podium, so please feel free to go to the podium and ask a question. I'm going to just start out with a question. Okay, so one real brief one. So was anyone wearing a Che Guevara shirt at that conference by chance?
We saw a couple Che shirts, and I actually asked one kid why he had that. I said, well, we were literally at the bar, and I said, hey, why'd you get the shirt? Why'd you wearing the shirt? And he's like, literally, I just let it look cool. He didn't know who Che Guevara really was. And of course, I wasn't at that time inclined to tell him about all the homosexuals he murdered and all the political opponents of the Castro regime that he literally murdered. So it wasn't the social setting to do that. But again, you see, it's cool. It was cool. It was a cool shirt. So I did see it. There wasn't like there were very many though. It was like 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think that's why most people wear that shirt.
In Argentina, they have a phrase, I can't say it in Spanish off the top of my head, but it's, I'm wearing a Che shirt and I don't know why.
Okay. So then my real question is this. I think it's very interesting, and again, in your last chapter, you talk about that a lot of the people don't really understand what socialism is at the Socialist Convention. And we've done a survey nationwide of students where we find that a lot of students associate socialism with like hyper redistribution. They don't think about like a state-run economy. And then similarly, capitalism, there's a lot of students that think about cronyism, not free market capitalism. So then people in society blame climate change, capitalism, racism, capitalism, any problem, they name capitalism without even really thinking about what it is. Do you guys have solutions other than, us promoting your book about how can we, these are university students that don't understand what socialism really is, or capitalism. So how can we educate people better? Or is there a solution? It's a tough question.
Let me try on the capitalism side a little bit. We got to get our phrasing a little bit better to understand the nature of what it is. Capitalism is cooperation. So people don't usually tend to think it, but it's cooperation between buyers and sellers. Every time we're not using violence and we're interacting and swapping stuff, that's cooperating. And cooperating sounds really good to most of people. But then they hear competition, cutthroat competition. Well, it's sellers that compete with sellers. Buyers compete with buyers. Buyers and sellers are cooperators. And we're really just trying to find ways to enrich each other's lives in cooperating in a market economy. There is no such thing as an economy. An economy is just you and me cooperated, and then some guys in suits like us, make statistics about it. But when we understand the process like that, it doesn't seem so threatening the way people like to use the words. You want to try the socialism side?
Yeah. I mean, it's perfectly okay. I mean, languages change, and if the language is changing to the point where the word socialism no longer means what we think it means, state control of resources, if it now means a big welfare state or more redistribution, I suppose that's okay because language evolves. But I don't think the Bolsheviks, when they were riding from village to village trying to drum up support for their cause, were talking to them about the intricacies of Marxian socialist thought. They went in and says, hey, if you give us power, if you support us, we're going to fix the problems of your life. And so I think that socialists of today, who are still real socialists out there, they're using this banner of socialism. Hey, give us power and we'll fix the ism. It's racism, sexism, whatever ism is of concern to you. And those are real isms that we should be concerned about. I'm not saying they're not. But that they're using that as a recruiting tool. So I still think there's rhetorical value in reminding people that actual socialism is an evil system that has resulted in misery everywhere it's been tried. And that doesn't mean we should ignore the isms that we're concerned about.
Right, yeah, good.
Sorry, man.
First of all, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. So I have 2 questions. So first of all, I'm from Vietnam. So I'm wondering why you include Vietnam in your research. That's the first question. So the second question, like, do you consider like Vietnam something similar like China, face socialism you mentioned? And the third question is about, you mentioned about the mechanism, right? So socialism is about a final ideal or the end goal, right? But you criticize about the mechanism how to go to over there, right? So what we criticize now is about the current started now. But they say that, oh, this is just something we're moving toward the end, the mechanism. They're just trying to move towards socialism. So it's not socialism now. It's something they're trying to target in the futures. So like the way that Vietnam and China are doing now, so they said, oh, this is their mechanism to move towards socialism, right? So do you think that with their current approach, will they be able to move to socialism like in the future? So this is like a good way they applying now.
You want to take 1 and 2 or 3?
Well, 1 and 2 are much easier.
I know. That's why I was giving you the chance.
The answer is 1 and 2. Thank you. Yeah, the short answer is the publisher actually asked us if we were interested in doing a follow-up like paperback that might have some revised chapters and maybe a new chapter. And Vietnam was sort of number 1 on our list of next places to go. But I do think that it would read a lot like the China chapter. Vietnam, just like China, experienced a period of real hard, total socialism, where the state attempted to control essentially the entirety of the economy. And then, more or less along the same time period, Vietnam underwent a series of more market-friendly reforms. And again, it's not Hong Kong. It's not a free market economy. But today, I think Vietnam is a very mixed economy where there's a lot of private enterprise and profit and loss, and prices are driving most people's lives. It's not state employment for most people now. So the chapter would have, I think, looked a lot like a sort of a mini version, maybe perhaps less dramatic version of the China chapter, but the content would have been similar. Ben, you get the hard one.
Yeah, I'll add one twist to the Vietnam chapter. If we did it, we would have got to work in more anti-war stuff.
Yeah.
Bob and I are both anti-war, anti-imperialism, and we get some of this into the last chapter in response to the student demands, but doing it in a U.S. foreign policy context in the history of Vietnam War would have made it into the Vietnam chapter. Otherwise, it would have been a China take 2. So, all right, ready? We're gonna geek out or dork out for a second here. Like if I understood the question correctly, to put this though in like the Marxian system, right? The difference between communism and socialism. Communism is the final stage of the Marxian system. This is the goal, right? So state socialism is supposed to evolve to final communism, where the state withers away and we enter the land of plenty and we have plenty of production, but there's no more state, there's no authoritarian. This is the wonderful la-la land. Now there's no mechanism in Marx that gets you from there to there. But there's also incorrect mechanisms in Marx that go from capitalism to state socialism, where all of his predictions writing in the 19th century about increasing concentration of industry, increasing immiseration of the proletariat, where wealth is concentrated in the bourgeoisie. This is what will lead to the socialist revolution. And then we go into state socialism, where the state owns the means of production, and then final communism. Well, all of his predictions in the other one are wrong. Compared to the mid-19th century when he's writing this, the average person in a capitalist economy today lives much richer than any of the richest robber barons ever lived before the turn of the 20th century. So the scientific part of his socialist thing is just empirically freaking wrong. So you never get there from here. But I do think it's an important distinction for normal people today who get confused between capitalism and, between communism and socialism. And they'll say things about communist Soviet Union but no, listen, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a socialist economy, and it had all the communist political parties are using the Marxian rhetoric of the aspirational end stage, where you get to land of plenty and state withering away, but their reality is all state socialism. Doorcat, back off. We'll talk about beer next.
I'm going to add on just one thing. So it is a rhetorical trick that socialists have always used. It's like, well, we're still working on socialism. We'll get it right next time. You know, the Soviet Union was famous for a 5-year plan. That 5-year plan didn't work. Well, the next 5-year plan is going to work. We're going to perfect socialism. The reality is, of course, it never got perfected. It never really worked. So we should be very skeptical of the claims that many socialists make and still make, that it's either never been tried or we haven't had time to perfect it yet. But let's face it, the Soviet Union was filled with massive numbers of really, really smart people. I mean, some of the most highly educated scientists and engineers to ever be created on this planet were Russian, Soviet scientists and engineers, and they couldn't get it right. And the reason they couldn't get it right is for fundamental economic reasons. So I think we should just sort of reject out of hand the sort of claim that many socialists want to make that, well, we just haven't had a chance to get it right. I mean, it was well tried by some of the most capable people to ever exist. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I tend to look at things upside downside. So we've heard many downside things about socialism. This may be a situation and there isn't an upside. Is there anything upside about socialism?
Let me say something that I think we do forget. I think there's a tendency on the part of people like me, perhaps, free market people like me, people who are essentially capitalists in one way or another, to want to paint socialist day-to-day life in the Soviet Union as being like this despotic, robotic, you just put your head down, you walked like an automaton from place to place. That's actually not true. I mean, people in when spring came in Moscow and the birds chirped and the flowers bloomed, they put smiles on their faces, and they when they were teenagers and young, they fell in love and held hands and went to the park and kissed their first kiss, and like they were human beings who existed and had a lot of the same kinds of day-to-day joys and disappointments that everyone has on Earth. The economy was terrible, but like it wasn't like it was a prison. Now I think maybe North Korea might not be so described. I think North Korean day-to-day life is actually utterly despotic on an almost day-to-day constant basis. But I think we do paint a picture of total despair. And so today, now that say Russia isn't socialist anymore, it's something else. It's not quite capitalist yet either, but it's something else. There are people who are nostalgic for their youth, and they remember some fond times in that period of time, and I think that's natural. I think they're remembering the holding of hands and the spring flowers more than they're remembering the KGB or the fact they couldn't get butter, things like that. But I understand that certain elements of that nostalgia from certain people.
So let me pick up on one theme of that and put a finer point on a part of it. Transition is hard. So the fundamental fact of life is in the socialist economies, everybody wakes up in the wrong place, goes to work in the wrong place, and produces the wrong thing every day. So when you reform that, because the relative price structure is wrong, so you don't have the right scarcities, you reform that, everyone's got to readjust. The more your human capital is specific to going to work in the wrong place, from the wrong place to make the wrong thing, the harder that adjustment is. So for older people during transition, it's absolutely true that their lives got worse as these places were starting to reform, because their human capital didn't scale the same way. They benefited, and this isn't just saying the ruling elites or something like that. They obviously lose. But transition, just like international trade flows in the United States as things change, where older workers who are specific in one industry have a harder time adjusting than younger workers. I think that would be my best non-ruling elite type of version of losers of the transition.
Yeah, there is an anecdote. It's not entirely true, but if you get into a cab in, say, Moscow, and if the cab driver's, say, 60 or so or older, you can almost ask him, did you study physics or math? Because the Soviet central planners over-invested in the production of mathematicians and physicists. And it was fine when when the state central plan created lots of institutes for physics and lots of institutes for mathematics, but they're really over-invested in those occupations. And then, of course, once the Soviet central plan failed and went away, there just aren't that many jobs for theoretical physicists and mathematicians, so they end up driving cabs. And that's got to be a bit of a letdown. I mean, quite seriously, if you plan to be a a theoretical physicist and have stature and work at a university or an institute, and now that institute has no jobs. It's tough.
So my question just is, with your research, have you guys looked at the quality of healthcare between socialist and capitalist countries, and what have you found there? Because that's the one thing that we talk about a lot, I feel like, in the US is there should be free healthcare for everyone, but that would mean a socialist system of healthcare. So, like, what does that look like, and are they getting quality care, or are they lacking in that area too?
Yeah. So this book that Bob and I did, I think, communicates findings of social science and history and economic theory. It isn't the research itself. In our other parts of our life, we do the other things of research, and then we summarize some of it in what goes into this. So for the healthcare thing, I think, first of all, in the United States, right? So like we said earlier, there's no purely capitalist, purely socialist, everything's on a spectrum. In the United States, our education system is a socialist education system. It's government ownership of the means of production in that industry. In healthcare, it's a fascist organization. So it's not government ownership, it's mostly private ownership, but with pervasive government controls. By the way, using the word fascist does not mean racism or other things here. It means private ownership coupled with massive state control, so it's not market signals. I would say that on net, our healthcare system is that in the United States. When we look at the socialist ones, we can give you some. So Venezuela put in their constitution that healthcare is a right, and you have extraordinarily high infant mortality. As Bob mentioned, people losing weight. The hospital care in Venezuela is absolutely atrocious. Putting a right on a positive right, a right to something, requires someone to deliver it. And if your economic system can't deliver it, it doesn't come through. Go to old Soviet Union. We spend some time on this one, particularly with women's health care in it, of the disaster it was in terms of some fairly gruesome stuff in terms of abortion rates and how it was administered in the Soviet Union back then. Usually the shining example people will use is Cuba. Cuba has long life expectancies and supposedly a very good healthcare system. One regret from our trip to Cuba is that we didn't get inside hospitals to take pictures, because there's 3 different healthcare systems in Cuba. There's the one for the ruling elite, that's pretty good. There's the one for the international people who come and they pay for healthcare services that the government, remember, government ownership of the means of production, government owns the healthcare. Government uses that for revenue. Then there's the one for the average Cubans. That one ain't very good. You gotta bring your own sheets when you go to the hospital. In terms of life expectancies though, the statistics, and this is where I've actually done some research and journal articles on it, the life expectancy at birth, at birth in Cuba looks really high, especially, usually you see life expectancy and income statistics go together. Cuba's like an anomaly, it's way off, of low incomes, very long life expectancies. Well, what's going on there? One part of it is, if you literally nationalize all of the income and give the government control, if you want to prioritize healthcare, you can prioritize healthcare to some extent, just like the Soviets can put a cosmonaut in space. However, knowing what the system is for the average person, this doesn't pass the smell test. Then look at the rate of abortion in Cuba compared to everywhere else. It's like 3 standard deviations off the charts. Well, what's happening? They're aborting high-risk pregnancies, forced abortions of high-risk pregnancies. But if you're aborted, you don't die early, then you're not counted in bringing down the average life expectancy. But someone dying at 1 month old or 3 months old, when your average life expectancy is 79 years, whoa, that moves the numbers. But if you force all of them out of the statistics by stopping them from living at all, then, so I've done some healthcare journal articles with a medical doctor and a historian who does statistics stuff that looked and tried to adjust. They still have long life expectancies, but this pulls it down more into the norm. And then other things like, they don't have cars. Don't have car accidents. How do young people die? Car accidents. Like, there's a whole bunch of these.
Yeah.
Salt, yeah, and the salt.
That's
if you take the spice out of life, life can last longer but more boring. So Cuba would usually be the example people would hold up as the successful one, and I'm just saying it's not a success story of, oh, it's because healthcare is so great. It's like, no, healthcare is great for 2 of the 3 groups. For one, it's not that great. That means there's other stuff driving the life expectancies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so I'll ask you, so was there anything super surprising in your tour? I mean, something that you were expecting when you visited these countries that was way different than when you experienced it, was way different than what you expected at all?
Yeah, I won't say it was surprising, but because I think when we went to Venezuela, I think we expected it to be kind of bad. But I didn't expect, I guess this was a surprise, I didn't expect to have a personal emotional reaction the way I did. I left it out of my talk by accident, but I can talk about it now. There was a couple we talked to, Paulo and Ana Maria, they're mentioned in the book, and we tried to interview a lot of people who were crossing the border. Most of them were not interested in talking to 2 gringos, you know, but they were, and they had driven 3 days, one way, so it's a 6-day round trip from Ciudad Bolivar, which is a city on the far side of Venezuela, so more or less on the Brazilian or the Guyana side of the country, drive all the way over to the border. So it'd be the equivalent of driving from North Dakota, from Fargo to St. Petersburg, Florida, and they were going grocery shopping. So it's a 3-day trip to buy food. And it really hit me because as we were talking to them, they were just a young couple, freshly married. I think they had a child at home, and they left them with relatives, and they took this 3-day one. I mean, how bad does your life have to be? Nothing in my existence has ever been so bad that I felt the need to get in a car and drive 3 days to buy, you know, rice. And these weren't peasants. These weren't poor people. They spoke some English. Paulo worked in a hotel. They were middle-class Venezuelans who had been driven to this sort of absolute level of despair. And it really hit me emotionally. It's like, wow, this is like this is not a statistic that economists are usually dealing with. It was a real human tragedy.
Yeah, and so I'll agree with Bob on that one. And it wasn't just them, but actually most people on that border were not poor Venezuelans. They were upper middle class Venezuelans who still had some access to hard currency to come there and be able to buy stuff. The really poor ones were the ones still inside who couldn't do it. I'll tell a different story, very brief, of a university student in Havana that we met. He met us on the stairs walking up. Very briefly, he commented, "Oh, where are you from?" We tell him, we talk for a little bit, and he says, "Yeah, it's so great when Americans come here. When Americans come here, they bring a little bit more." And Bob and I knew what his next word was going to be, like money, a little bit more wealth, like you spend money here. No, he says a little bit more freedom. And this idea of cultural exchange, of trade, and this is part of why Bob and I think the embargo is a bad idea against Cuba. I think more cultural interaction and trade with them helps spread the ideas of freedom more than giving the Cuban government a scapegoat to put up their posters of the blockade and Uncle Sam getting punched in the face. Instead, interact with them and we can spread these ideas. And I think that university student understood it better than a lot of social scientists.
Yeah, cool.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that you can't get an iPhone out of a worker cooperative. And there's obviously a lot that goes in. That's a really complicated sort of topic. So I just want to ask 2 sort of simple questions related to that. So why couldn't Apple, for example, at founding have been founded as a worker co-op? And why can't Apple today exist as a worker co-op?
Yeah, so worker co-ops don't scale very well usually for a very good reason. I mean, first of all, the real issue is scale. I mean, in order to make something like an iPhone requires the cooperative efforts of quite literally millions and millions and millions of people. I mean, the component parts are mined and manufactured all over the planet. They're transported in ships and airplanes and trucks. All of these things are massive undertakings. And the management that's required to undertake that kind of those kinds of projects they require scale. And if one of the challenges of worker-run enterprises is is having to, what the word means is we're going to involve the workers in the management decisions of the firm. Well, that means we have to pause and, okay, what do you guys think we should do? And you have to have a meeting and a vote. That's all what we call transactions cost. If you're in a business school, you may have read Ronald Coase, The Theory of the Firm. The reason we have business firms is because the transactions costs are really high to negotiate everything all the time. And worker-run enterprises, the essence of a worker-run enterprise is to have the workers actively engaged in the decision-making of the firm. That itself is so hard and so costly and so time-consuming that it's okay if you're running a brewery. But remember, the brewery actually doesn't make the barley or the hops or build the trucks that delivered the hops or anything else. They're just doing the part, you know. So that's the issue. This is why we're in a business school. I mean, the reason firms exist is to handle the complex management that's required to coordinate all these resources together for a particular purpose. And worker-run enterprises, colloquially, they gum up the works. It's just so hard to run and have everybody's voice heard like that. And frankly, inside of businesses, they're command and control to a point. But the reason it works inside of a business is because you have markets outside the business, you've got market prices and signals outside the business, you've got wages which are set by markets for workers, and all of that. So I think the reason is scale. And that doesn't mean, I really love worker-run enterprises as a concept. I think we should explore how they can be scaled up, but all the evidence and all the business school training that I've seen suggests that it's pretty hard.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you made this in your earlier points on it, that in a purely market system, they're free to flourish too.
Yeah.
So when we observe that all of the ones that get big, that we have small niche worker co-ops, but the stuff that gets big isn't, that's telling me the selection mechanism is that it's not a very efficient way of negotiating these theoretical points about transactions that you're making.
Yeah.
Because if someone like comes up with a better way to run a worker co-op, well, then cool, can do it. I also, by the way, we both work in worker co-ops called universities. And God, man, I see the inefficiencies inside of those things all the time.
Quick question. You referenced you didn't like the high alcohol taxes in Sweden. You did reference that you were able to maybe tax deduct some of your business expenses by taking this trip.
Hell yeah.
Tell me about tax reform in America. Where do you see us going from a capitalistic society?
That's a tough question. You know, so I don't have a strong opinion on what's going to happen in the United States with respect to tax reforms. I'm going to be a little bit ecumenical here and say market economies can't exist in a range of tax systems. I mean, I would love to. I've had a little bit of a beer here, so I'm almost an anarchist now. I would love to live in a world perhaps without a government, but it sounded nice to even say it. But the reality is governments exist on this planet everywhere that anyone exists, there's a government. And all those governments are going to have tax systems. There's a great variety of tax systems, whether you want to talk about income taxes, flat taxes, consumption taxes, and you can get all, I'm a public finance by training, that's my field. You can get very wonky about that. I'm actually kind of ambivalent now. I think one tax system is almost the same as the next. What does matter is the sort of overall level, and I don't think we talk enough about the level. I mean, at the end of the day, say in the United States right now, roughly 1 out of every $3 that's generated is taxed away and spent by the people that didn't create it. And that means we're, in a sense, maybe 1/3 socialist, but I don't equate taxation to socialism really. But you know, I think if it would be better if it was 20%, but I don't think that's a huge story. Like compared to the socialism story, that's huge. Whether you're socialist or not is huge. If the bulk of your economy is organized by socialism versus bulk of your economy is organized by capitalism, you'll get a very different planet. If your economy is a market economy that has 20% taxation or 30% taxation, you'll be different, but it's not a difference that I'm going to lose a lot of sleep about. I'll write a paper about it, you know, but it's not that critical to our existence.
Generate a lot of citations.
Yeah, right, citations.
And we're almost almost out of time, but I'll just ask you one last question that we ask all of our Menard family distinguished speakers. So could you give a piece of advice for students, just advice for the future? Any piece of advice you'd give them?
Yeah, I got you one. So since this was a travel book and we went to places and Bob said don't go to Cuba, I agree. We were all really worried about spring break Havana back when travel was more liberalized there because your credit cards don't work, your cell phones don't work, and it is still an authoritarian state. I'm like, that's going to be a shit show. What I would say is go to Georgia. Georgia's beautiful, it's reforming, and I'm not one of these who wants to trap the world to be different so I can visit it, but when I was a college student or shortly thereafter, going to Eastern Europe was fundamentally different than going to Paris or London or something. Prague is now a Western European city. It's a developed, wonderful place. It's beautiful. But the vibe there is not that much different. Georgia's the frontier of development of a place that's growing rapidly, doing well, but basically had an almost generation lag of getting going on that compared to Eastern Europe. If I was a college student and I wanted to experience something like that, that's where I'd go now.
I'm going to be more flippant. Just narrow advice for college students. You have 3 ways to spend your time. You can study, you can party, and you can work or have a sport, work sport. Choose 2, because no one can do all 3. If you want to party and work, you should drop out and go party and work. If you want to study and party, you can do that, but don't have a job. You get 2 out of 3. Your life you'll fail at college if you try to do all those things. And so I was one of those college students who did all 3, but most can't. I'm a college professor now. I can trust me, you can't do it. So pick your poison. I hope you pick the study and party. But if you need to work, sacrifice work. Or if you need to work, sacrifice party so you work a little bit.
Okay, thanks. And so one more round of applause. Thank you.